Now, I'm going to give you a little background on my wife and myself, just so you understand where we're coming from, a little bit about our journey as Christians. We got saved back in 1979. We were living in Fairbanks, Alaska, or actually in North Pole, which is outside of Fairbanks. And one of our, God puts gifts in us that kind of drives us to do certain things. If you're a pastor, you know you're a pastor because God's called you to be a pastor. And you can't hardly get away from it, if you know what I mean. Now, I've been a pastor a couple different times for 2 or 3 years at a time, but that's not really my calling. My calling is more of an evangelist. I've been involved in apologetics, doing missionary work. We've been to all around the U.S. We've done missionary work on boats in Alaska, been to Scotland, England, doing outreach to Muslims there. Been to Haiti is on a medical mission. My wife was actually the dentist. I was one of the chaplains on the team. So God puts things in us to kind of push us along for His sake, for His will. And a few years after my wife and I got saved, we shared the gospel with a lot of our friends, and eventually we kind of run out of friends. Some responded in a positive way and some not so positive. And then we begin to do more outreach, and we begin to find out there's different Jesuses out there. You got the Mormon Jesus, you got the Baha'i Faith Jesus, you got the Jehovah's Witness Jesus. You could go down the list. And so as an evangelist, it's helpful to understand how to communicate our differences, or understand how they came about and how they think. And back in 1988, I had a friend of mine in Fairbanks that he had a recording studio, and he produced jingles and stuff for a local radio station. And he got to know some people in England, and to make a long story short, he encouraged us to go to England to study a little bit about Islam so we'd understand a little better about what we were doing. Now, I had published this tract here, which is God so loved Muslims that He gave them Jesus. Now, this is kind of the good cop approach to trying to reach Muslims. And the reason I say that is because it quotes a lot out of the Quran, which are things that are in common with the Bible. But you can only take that so far, okay, because there's an awful lot in the Quran that opposes the Bible, okay, in Jewish and Christian history. But anyway, what we did was we flew to England, and if anybody here ever been to England, been to London, so you've probably been to Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. And every Sunday afternoon, we were told, go there. If you want to learn how to debate with Muslims, go to Hyde Park. Go to Speaker's Corner, because you'll see the Muslims there. They have their soapbox, and they'll get up and speak. And then you'll have the Christians that are brave enough to do so. They'll stand up on their soapbox and give their spiel, trying to reach the lost. And it's a big tourist attraction. There's hundreds of people that come there from all over the world just to hear these people talk. And so the first Sunday that we went there, we just watched and listened and tried to learn, okay, what are the weak places, the weak links in our Christian beliefs that we don't have good answers for, because that's where the Muslims attack. That's where they want to argue, right? I mean, that's typical of all the cults. They target areas that we're weak in, that we don't have good defenses for. Okay, so then the second time that we went there, I had learned a little bit more, and like I say, I had already published this tract, so I've been studying Islam for several years. But there's one thing to learn things out of books. It's quite another thing to apply it in practical application in real life. And I'm kind of a hands-on kind of person. I like to get out and mix it up with people. Peggy and I, over the past 30 some odd years, we have gone to Jehovah's Witness conventions with a camera, interviewed people. We've gone to grand openings of Mormon temples around the U.S. We've gone to, the Mormons have an open pulpit once, the first Sunday of every month. You can go there and give your testimony, and we've done it a number of times, and it's always very exciting. And but it opens doors to talk to people, and oftentimes you'll find people there that really, maybe it's their first time to a Mormon church, and they have no idea what they're getting into, and you happen to show up and say that Joseph Smith is a false prophet, And of course, that doesn't go over very well, but it provides opportunity to talk to people. So when we went to England, the second week that we were there in Speaker's Corner, there was this young guy from Morocco, and he had a little 3-step ladder, and he was up preaching, and he quoted out of Deuteronomy chapter 18, which they're famous for, that God's going to send a prophet like Moses. That's one of their favorite verses, and he's going to be with us forever. Huh? Well, Muhammad's not with us forever, and then they will refer to passages out of the Gospel of John. We're speaking of the Holy Spirit that Jesus said was going to come, be our comforter. He would guide us into all truth, and he would, of course, point to Jesus. And they say that the comforter is Muhammad. Well, again, Muhammad is not with us forever. So there's some problems with some of their arguments. But anyway, this guy is giving his spiel, and like I say, I didn't know all that much about Islam up to that point, but I did know one thing, that they believe in this thing called jihad. That's to do away with the infidel, or the kafirs as they call us. Okay? It's a derogatory term for us infidels. And he was talking about how if the whole world would just turn to Islam, there'd be world peace. So I raised my hand and I said, well, what about jihad? And he ignored me. And there's several dozen people gathered around, and a few minutes later I raised my hand again. I said, but what about jihad? And it isn't long before the whole crowd, by this time it's getting to maybe 50 or 60 people, it isn't long before they're going, what about jihad? What about jihad? And I'm going, whoa, Well, this guy comes flying down off his ladder, and he sticks his finger in my face. He says, you know nothing about jihad. And I'm going, whoa, I know one thing. I'm glad there's lots of witnesses here. And I told him that. I said, well, I know one thing, pal. I'm glad there's lots of people here, because if there weren't lots of witnesses, you'd probably cut my throat. And of course, most of the crowd said, yeah, that's right. That's what Islam is all about. So, and we had gone to the largest mosque one Friday, and Friday is their day of worship. We'd gone to the largest mosque in London, the Regent's Park Mosque, and we went there. We went to England with a whole backpack full of these things. We had about 1,000 of these to pass out, and a few other gospel tracts. And so we tried to get some of our British Christian friends to go with us. They said, no way, you guys are nuts. So we were pretty naive back then, But then in 1988, it wasn't quite the way it is today. I mean, you couldn't get away today with what we did back then. It wasn't likely. You'd end up like, you guys familiar with Tommy Robinson? You understand his story? Well, I'll share a little bit about that. So that was kind of our introduction to hands-on trying to speak to Muslims. Okay, but there was a positive side of our trip. While we were in Oxford, my wife and I had a day to ourselves. Our friends had things that they were committed to, so we thought, well, we'll just go for a walk. And we walked down to Chris, it's a big university town, so there's this, beautiful buildings, and the university pretty much takes over the whole town. But as we were walking through town, we ran onto this Mormon church, and I'm going, let's go in here and check it out. This is like the middle of the week. I forget what day it was, Wednesday or Thursday or something. And so we opened the sanctuary door and walked in, and there's this couple sitting in the sanctuary by themselves, blonde-haired gal and this dark-complected guy, looked Middle Eastern. And as soon as we walked in, they said, oh, come on in, are you members of the church? And I said, no, we're Christians. So you can guess where this is headed. Huh? And she says, well, we're Christians. And I said, well, we sat down and began to talk to him. And this gal was from Yugoslavia, and her husband, Khalid, was from Israel. And that's where they had met. And they'd come to England to go to school. Okay? And so after, we talked to them for a while, and this gal was a real strong-willed, kind of obnoxious person. I mean, I was really having a hard time with her, because she would ask me a question about why I didn't believe that Joseph Smith was the prophet of God, and as I would start to answer, and she'd cut me off and ask another question, and it just went on like this for about 10 minutes, and finally I just got a little frustrated, and I said, you are the rudest person I've ever met in my life. I said, you ask a question, I go to answer, you cut me off. And I said, what's that about? And her husband, all this time, he's real quiet. I thought he was going to get mad at me, But he says, he's right, Maria. You are rude. Let the man speak. Oh, wow, this is pretty cool. So I said, okay. So I tried to remember all her questions. He says, I'll give you 10 minutes. You go ahead and answer the questions that Maria asks. And so I started going down the list. And then she looks, when I get towards the end, she looks at her watch. She goes, well, I have to go to work, so you can stay and talk to Alan, but I have to go. And so she leaves, and we're sitting in the sanctuary of the Mormon church, and he gets up and watches her out the window walk down the sidewalk, and then he turns, he says, you're from America. You know about this Joseph Smith. I know nothing. I married her thinking this was just a Christian church. And so we need to talk. Well, about that time, the bishop of the Mormon church's wife comes walking in, and she overheard some of our chat. And she says, you must go. So we have to leave. We go to a coffee shop, and we spent about an hour with this guy. And he began to tell us that he's really fearful because he says, to start with, my marriage is not doing well. He says, you can tell my wife is very strong-willed, and we're having some issues. And he says, secondly, my visa is about to expire, and I'm going to have to go back to Israel, and because I'm an apostate now, marrying not only a Christian, but a Mormon so-called Christian, he says, somebody in my family will kill me when I go back. And he was very afraid. And I said, well, Halid, do you ever pray for your marriage? Pray for your wife. No, I pray to God. Now see, Muslims kind of, not all Muslims, but the majority of them have this kind of concrete way of thinking that God is going to do what he's going to do, and he's not going to change anything for us, okay? So when you talk about predestination, they are the extreme. We wouldn't call them Calvinists, but that's kind of the way it is, Everything's set in stone and predestined, and they pray to God, and however it works out is God's will, good or bad. Okay, so that's kind of how they think. So, I said, well, you should pray to God to help him, to have him help you with your marriage. And I said, secondly, pray that God gives you an extension on your visa. And then I gave him this tract. And I said, of course, they say they believe in Jesus. It's quite a different Jesus, but they do believe in Jesus, and Jesus is in the Quran. Talks a lot about Jesus in the Quran. So I said, well, Halid, what have you got to lose? I said, we have some differences, but try this. I said, we'll probably never see each other again, but try this. Pray to God in the name of Jesus that he would help you with your marriage and give you an extension on your visa. And he says, yeah, okay. And there was some other things that happened that will take up too much time to share. We ended up going to the Mormon church the next Sunday, and that's a whole different story, but a wild story. But God used it. It was just amazing. So we were out of town for a couple of weeks. We got up to Scotland, and then we came back to Oxford. We're staying with our friends, and we're walking down the street, 2 weeks later, and lo and behold, here's Halid on his bicycle. And I go, whoa, this is a God thing, And he says, he's across the street, they had the double-decker buses and the black cabs, zipping back and forth. And, he says, hey, he sees us across the street, and he jaywalks across through all the traffic, and he comes over, he says, I have to tell you what happened. I did what you told me. I prayed in the name of Jesus. I got an extension on my visa, and our marriage is doing so much better. And Maria now, she thinks that maybe the Mormon church is what you said it is. A cult. And I went, praise God. So God uses some of the craziest things. And Peggy and I, this has kind of been the pattern of our ministry for some over 35 years now. He has sent us all over the place. After 9/11, we were living, we did boat ministry. We lived on a couple different sailboats, sailed from Valdez, Alaska, up and down the coast to Seattle. I pastored a church on Bainbridge Island for 3 years. Got in trouble with the gay community over there. Not any Muslims on Bainbridge Island to speak of. But when 9/11 happened, now see, when we came back from England, we tried to share what we experienced, because we traveled up North England to Bradford and Leeds to a large textile cities. And you go to the university there, and most everything on the bulletin board is either in Farsi or in Arabic, you know? And you feel like you're in a foreign country, but you're in a British country, an English environment. And so we go, wow, this, a lot of the churches are being converted to mosque, and this is clean back in '88. And now it's far worse than that. Okay, so after our experience over there and seeing, 1,000 guys come pouring out of the mosque there in London, and we're passing out literature, and their reaction to us, and of course, like I said, we were pretty naive, we were used to doing evangelism to people that would either ignore us or respond in a positive way, And these guys, they get worked up, I mean to tell you. I was standing out in front of the mosque there one Friday, and I got a backpack on and a big stack of these tracts, and passing them out. The guys are coming out after prayer, and they put their shoes back on and they're pouring out of this place. And they're catching cabs and buses, and they're going back to work. And here we're passing out the literature, and Peggy's standing back there with a camera to see how things are going to go. And a lot of them are polite enough. They're taking the literature and they're just going on their way. But then eventually some of them start looking at it and they're going, "Hey, we don't believe Jesus is God." And I said, "Yeah, okay, I got work to do, so just hold on, I'm passing out the literature." And then eventually some of them read enough of it to know that we were trying to evangelize them, and they got pretty upset, and they started tearing up the tracts and they're throwing them at me, and I'm just trying to ignore them. I'm keep passing them out, Yeah, well, praise God, And eventually I thought, well, here these guys are littering right on the porch of this big mosque. And I said, you're not a very good Muslim. Here you are littering right here on the steps of your mosque. And that was the perfect thing to say, because a whole bunch of other Muslims started saying, "He's right, you're not a very good Muslim." And they got to arguing amongst themselves, and of course I continued on with what I was doing. So, fast forward, we're on Bainbridge Island, and 9/11 happens. And most of you probably can remember exactly where you were the moment that happened. And I'm watching it. Peggy got up. She was commuting downtown to Seattle. She was working at a dental office. And she was up before me, and she flipped on the TV. And we're living on a sailboat, a 47-foot sailboat at the time. And she says, "Hey, check this out." And the first plane had already hit the towers. And then just as I got up, the second plane hit the towers, and then we hear another plane is heading towards Washington, D.C., and I go, whoa, this is incredible. Now see, up to this point, most of the people that I tried to share our experience in England with in America, they weren't interested. They said, well, that's not going to come here. We're America, And there's an ocean between us. And I said, yeah, that's going to come here, guaranteed. Well, after 9/11 happened, a good friend of mine who was a radio and television producer, he had a station in Oak Harbor. He began to invite me up once a week to speak on this very issue. And of course, it's a military town, so a lot of the military understand what we're dealing with. So we had a pretty good audience up there. Then, right after 9/11, God began to speak to us about stopping what we were doing and go down the coast, visit as many Muslim mosques as you can find, and take a pile of literature with you. We had quite a few of these and some other tracts that we had published. Of course, by this time we had learned quite a bit more. We understood a little bit better how to communicate the gospel, some of the issues, the communication barriers that we're dealing with. And so Peggy quit her job, and I quit what I was doing, and we took off down the coast. Took the computer and tried to find every mosque that we could find from Seattle to San Diego. And normally, during the Obama reign, of course, the doors were wide open for the Saudis to build mosques all over the United States. And they started putting up mosques near all the universities. And then some of these rich Arabs were actually buying portions of these universities for Arabic studies. I believe that was the disguise, right? And so now in our universities, there's a real strong influence from the Middle East, and if you speak anything critical about Islam, you're in big trouble, okay? Now, knowing this, well, let me continue on. Here we ended up in San Diego, Now, the Mormons were going to be opening a new temple in Snowflake, Arizona. So, and then the Mormon Olympics were going to be happening shortly after that. So we were trying to incorporate about 3 months of evangelism on the road, on our way from Bainbridge Island to San Diego to Snowflake, the opening of the Mormon temple, and then the Mormon Olympics were going to be on the streets there for 3 weeks. So we get to San Diego and we tried to make contact with a few churches there because we heard that there's a lot of Muslims in Southern California. I mean, there are literally thousands of them. And so we had already touched base with quite a few and picked up quite a bit of their propaganda from some of their mosques and stuff. So we're learning more and more as we go. And they announced in the newspaper and on television that the Ramadan service that was going to happen while we were there was going to be held at the convention center in San Diego. Well, they'd never done this before, but because of 9/11, they're trying to promote Islam as the religion of peace. We all love each other. Well, they don't get along with each other. The reality is they don't get along with each other. You got the Shiites, you got the Sunnis, you got the Ahmadiyas, you got a bunch of different factions of Islam, and but because of 9/11, they wanted to spin for us that everything is wonderful, So all the mosques in Southern California, or at least in the San Diego area, decided they would get together at the convention center for the end of Ramadan, the Eid festival. And so we saw, well, hey, it's open to the public, ideal for us, So we went there with a pile of literature and a camera, and we tried to get some Christians to go with us, and they said, no, but we're going to be having a prayer meeting about Islam. Would you like to come? And I said, man, I didn't come all the way from Seattle to go to a prayer meeting. I could go to a prayer meeting there. I'm not opposed to prayer, but there's some things we need to do, and we need to, strike while the iron is hot. And they're having a convention here with thousands of Muslims showing up, and this is a place where we need to go to try to make a contact. So nobody was interested, so it was just us. We show up at the convention center. There's thousands of Muslims showing up, a lot of them in their traditional garb, wearing their taqiyya hats and their robes and all the different things, and the women are wearing hijabs and niqabs and all the different garb that they wear. And we go inside, and the two security guys standing at the door, they said, "Are you a Muslim?" I said, "No." They said, "Well, you can't come in." I said, "Well, why not?" "Well, do you have a press pass?" I said, "Well, no, I'm not with the press." "Well, then you can't come in." And there's camera crews from some of the local TV stations there. There's reporters, all outside, and they're interviewing people and broadcasting. And I said, "You guys advertised this was open to the public." "Man, we're the public." He says, "Now, who'd you say you were with?" "Dude, I'm with my wife." And they spoke in Arabic for a few minutes. He said, "No, you can't come in unless you're a Muslim." I said, "Look, pal, and you have to understand, Muslims win through intimidation. That's how they work. So you have to be just as in your face as they are sometimes, okay?" I said, "Listen, pal, if we can't come in a few minutes, I'm going to be over there in front of that camera crew. You guys are going to get some really bad press." And they spoke in Arabic for a few minutes. "Please come in, you're our guest." And I said, "Perfect, okay?" So we went inside, and here there's 7,000 Muslims in there. Of course, the women are all sitting in the very back. There's a lot more than that there now. This was right after 9/11. There's a lot of Muslims in California. Okay, so that was our first experience with Ramadan. And what they did is they had a guy get up that was a new convert, and he kind of gave his testimony as he was their poster boy. And that was pretty much it, really. The local imam, gave a little spiel, but then, so we left, and while we were outside, we passed out a pile of literature there, and there's still camera crews around and stuff, so we felt relatively safe. What are they going to do in front of a newscaster right here, So then we went on over to Tucson, In Tucson, there's a mosque right outside the university, and of course, right away we just visited the mosque. It was during the middle of the week, and we noticed on the bulletin board they've got a lot of their propaganda, and I took a sample of each one of them, and I left some of our tracts, and there was hardly anybody there, so they kind of ignored us, and we just did our thing and we left. But then as we walked around the university, and that was one of the things that we like to do, is go to universities and see what kind of propaganda they're posting, because oftentimes they'll have meetings that we can go to, to debate. And so we were posting some of our literature on the bulletin boards, and we picked up some of their stuff. And as I was posting one of these tracts and another one on a bulletin board there, this young guy pedals up on a bicycle, obviously a Middle Eastern dark-complected guy, and he says, "Can I see a copy of that?" And so I said, "Yeah, sure." I gave him a copy, and I'm watching out of the corner of my eye, because you never know how they're going to respond, if they're going to be friendly or they're going to get irate. And so I'm watching him, and I'm kind of just reading stuff on the board there, and he says, "Can I talk to you?" I said, "Sure." He says, "I'm from Iran, but because of 9/11, not very many Americans want to talk to me." It's understandable. But he says, "I have a lot of questions about Christianity, and I'd like to talk." I said, "Well, let's talk." He says, "Well, I can't right now. I have to go to class, but can we meet later?" And I'm thinking, yeah, he's going to set me up, he's going to invite some of his friends. This doesn't sound good. So I'm thinking, okay, well, where can we do this? I'm thinking just as quick as I can. I said, okay, yeah, sure, let's meet at, I think 6 or 7 o'clock on the steps of the library on the university. And I knew, I'd already been there, so I knew it was a big open space and, it'd be fairly safe. And so anyway, we met him there, and he shows up with a yellow legal pad, and he had a long list of questions. And one of the first questions he says, "Now, doesn't the Bible say that the earth is flat?" And now this is some of the misconceptions that Muslims have. And you'll find that most Muslims really don't know much about the Quran. They know what their imam has told them, or they know what their dad has told them, or some other Muslim leader, but oftentimes they've never read the Quran themselves. And so as you begin to read it, you can find out right away that you know more than they do. You don't have to know that much, really. And so anyway, I said, "Well, you remember Christopher Columbus, right?" He says, "Yeah." I said, "Did he think the world was flat?" And he went, "Oh." I said, "He was a Catholic." "Huh? Oh, yeah, I never thought of that." So we went down this long list of questions that he had, and at the end, tears started running down his face. And I'm going, wow, this is obviously the Holy Spirit's working on this guy, huh? And I said, "Would you mind if we prayed for you?" He says, "Well, do I have to get down? How do I pray?" Now, of course, they think you have to face Mecca, forehead on the ground. And if you notice, really devout Muslims, they often have a dark spot on their forehead, and that's a prayer bump. That's from literally sticking their forehead on the floor. Okay, so if you ever see pictures of terrorists, which often you see in the news, and they got that little brown spot there, they're devout guys. That's how you know. Okay, so he asked me, "How do I pray?" I said, "Well, God doesn't really care. We can talk to him standing up, sitting down, driving in the car, laying in our bed," and that was just a big shock for him, that God is so gracious that we can talk to him as a friend, and he was kind of shocked by that. And so we prayed with him, and he grabbed me. He kissed me on both cheeks, and then on the lips, and then on both cheeks, and then on the lips. And whoa, and he kept on, hey, I'm not used to this, And then he says, I'm so happy. I've asked many people questions, and nobody will talk to me. And in Iran, he says, the only Christians are Armenian, and we're not supposed to even fellowship with them because they're apostates, And but he says, of course, they're afraid of us too, so they don't want to talk to us. So he says it's very difficult to talk to a Christian in my country. But he says, you guys have been so helpful. I just happened to have 2 extra Bibles with me that day. I had a Gideon's Bible, and then I had another paraphrased Bible, which would have been a little easier for him to read because English being his second language, of course. So I gave him these 2 Bibles, and he says, I'm only going to be here for a couple more months. And he says, who do I turn to? And of course, we're traveling, so I don't know what kind of churches to send him to. I have no connections there. And I said, let's go inside the library, and I will show you where the Christian part of the library is, and I'll show you, a few books that might be helpful, and you can just let God lead you in your search, your journey, okay? And so I gave him 2 Bibles. We went in the library, and right away he's seen a couple books that talked about crusades, and of course that's not a positive word for them. You talk about crusades because they think of swords and battles, huh? But we think of crusades as doing outreach, So they have a different way of looking at a lot of the terms that we use. So anyway, he wanted to walk with us back to our car because we had to take off and he had things to do. And he says, can I walk with you back to your car? I said, sure. And he wanted to hold our hands. He's in the middle of us. We're walking down the sidewalk, heading back. And he's got this big smile on his face. He says, I'm so happy. And Peggy just launches out in prayer as we're walking down the sidewalk. He says, I never thought that I could talk to God while walking down a sidewalk. And that's the bondage that they're in. That their God is, in Mecca, they have this box, right? This black box. It's called the Kaaba. The Kaaba means cube in Arabic. That's why it's a black box. And I like to talk about it as God in a box because we're not supposed to put God in a box. God is beyond all of that stuff. Okay? Well, so that's kind of been our journey. And over the past few years locally in Eastern Washington, we're living over by the Tri-Cities. There's quite a few Muslims there, and because of the refugee programs that have taken place during the Obama administration, lots of Muslims from all over the world have come there, and a lot of them are peaceful Muslims, but a lot of them you don't know. And we've interviewed a lot of them. There's a large mosque in Richland, Washington. We've been there and interviewed people. I got in trouble with the imam there a couple different times. He's no longer there. I think we prayed him out. And then there's another mosque in Kennewick. It's an East African congregation mostly. The imam actually I think is from Bosnia. We've interviewed him. So he's a light-complected guy with a big red beard, and he's got a congregation of black people. So how that works is, and half of them don't speak English. I mean, I've tried to interview him, and you can't talk to him well enough to really carry on a conversation. So it's pretty difficult. But him, the Bosnian guy, he speaks very good English. And we've had some very good chats with him. We've had a chance to give him videos and different things like that. Now, these are people that are not likely to come to your church. I mean, to start with, they're scared to death of your church, and plus they've been programmed through the history of their theology and from the Quran. So they have a very twisted understanding of how Christianity is. As a matter of fact, try not to get ahead of myself. Let me read a few Bible verses before we go any further here, and then I'm going to read some stuff out of the Quran. Sometimes Christians, when I say I'm going to read out of the Quran, they'll go, "Oh, that's sacrilege." But you know what? We're in a battle, and if you're in a war, you have to know your enemy. Okay? And at least that's my way of looking at it. I'm not one for running away from battles. I'm one for getting in the mix, okay? So, in Jude, the very 3rd verse of the book of Jude says, Beloved, while I was making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you appealing that you contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. Okay? And then in Galatians chapter 1, probably you've being pastors, you're all very familiar with these verses. Galatians is a very good verse for dealing with Mormonism and Islam. Very first chapter, I'm going to start in verse 8. It says, But even though we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to that which we have preached to you, let him be accursed. As I've said before, so I say again, now if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to that which you've received, let him be accursed. Very strong language. Well, even if it's brought by an angel from heaven. Now we could, of course, use that to speak to our Mormon friends, but it speaks just as well to Islam because Muhammad supposedly got his revelation from Gabriel, or Jibril as they say. So, we have a problem. because their gospel is quite different than our gospel. Okay, then, if you turn to Ephesians, the 5th chapter of Ephesians, verse 11 says, "Do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them." Now, you can go out and talk about God amongst just about anybody, even atheists, and there's really not going to be a whole lot of conflict. But when you start talking about Jesus and begin to define what the Bible actually says about Jesus, then things begin to unravel. And that's usually the way it is with most of the cults and with Islam. Okay? So, they say, we believe in Jesus. Now, the first Quran that I picked up I picked it up in England. It was a Quran that was translated into English from Arabic. And it was in kind of Elizabethan King James style English, so it was kind of difficult to read. But the interesting part about it was, it was translated by a Brit who was critical of Islam. So all the commentary at the bottom of the page pointed out the problems with what you read in the top of the page. So it was very helpful for me, even though it was in Old English and you used Roman numerals and everything. And plus, it had been arranged in somewhat of a chronological order. Now you'll find reading the Quran, and I've got a number of copies of the Quran in my library. This is a very common one that they pass out at the mosque, a little paperback. This one here, this big Quran, are you familiar with the CARE organization? Anybody familiar with those guys? The CARE organization, they put out this flyer here, Support CARE, and it's got a picture of the Capitol building on it. Support CARE, Washington State. They go to the Capitol building and they lobby for the Muslims. Well, CARE, what they are kind of like the ACLU for Muslims. So if you get into problems with Islam, these are the guys that come after you. Okay? And we know from experience, a couple of years ago, my wife was working as a librarian in a little town in eastern Washington, and I had locked horns with the Imam of Richland on Facebook, and I put together a couple little programs I put up on YouTube, and put them up on the cable television stations around eastern Washington, free access stations. They can't keep you out. And of course, this Imam was very upset with me because I just pointed out the obvious. Well, the first thing that happened was he came to this little town. How he got the invite, I don't know. But he came to speak at the Rotary. Now, at the Rotary, these people, of course, relatively naive. He got them to recite the conversion prayer, the Shahada, I think is what it's called, after his spiel. Okay? And he quoted a very famous verse, which they always quote when they're trying to appease us kafirs. They quote out of chapter 5, verse 32. And to paraphrase, it goes something like this. To kill all of mankind is to kill one person, and to kill one person is to kill all of mankind. Therefore, we're a religion of peace. Okay? They never bothered to read or quote the second verse right after that, verse 33, or they call it Surah Ayat. Okay? Well, Surah 33 says, for those that resist Islam should be crucified and have their arms and legs cut off on opposite sides. So, of course, he never quoted that verse. So there was a gal who wrote an article in the paper about this Rotary experience, and she was a bit critical, and it was actually a pretty well done article, but of course she didn't know anything about the Quran. She didn't know that they'd been duped. They just thought he was a really nice guy and couldn't understand why he wanted to speak to the Rotary. And so then I wrote a letter to the newspaper pointing out verse 33, and I said, this is the one they failed to read to you. And of course they published my letter. I was kind of surprised because oftentimes a liberal paper will not print things critical of Islam. I've run into that many times. So that was our beginning experience with this Imam. Well then, fast forward a couple years, my wife is working in the library, She gets in a little trouble because she made a statement on Facebook that got people all riled up. And next thing you know, the imam hears about it, 30 miles away. He hears about it. And the imam comes to our school board to make trouble for us. Well, it just so happens the superintendent of our school district happens to be a Jewish guy. He's not really a practicing Jew, but you can imagine a little intimidating for him, huh? That here I stir things up, and Peggy stirs things up, gets the imam to come and pitch a fit at the school board meeting. So that, like I said, they win through intimidation. They like to bring fear and get us to just cower. Well, that's not me. I'm not the cowering kind of guy. Somebody tells me I can't preach the gospel or I can't ask questions, well, they've said the wrong thing, because I'm just going to get louder, okay? So that's where we're at. Now let me just read a couple verses out of my tract here, just to give you an idea of how they think. Now this is out of Surah 5, verse 49 through 51. It says, now you'll find in the Quran, like in Genesis, the Bible says, let us go down and make man in our image, use plural terms for the Godhead, right? Okay, well as Christians, we normally look at that as though it's referring to the Trinity, the triune nature of the Godhead, right? Okay, and we are created in the likeness of God. We're spirit, soul, and body. We are triune, okay, which is sometimes a good illustration to use to talk to Muslims, because they cannot wrap their head around this triune nature of the Godhead. That just doesn't make sense to them. Okay, and secondly, one of the things that they have issue with is, I'm getting ahead of myself. One of the reasons they have problems with the Trinity is because their understanding of the Trinity is based on Muhammad's misconception of the Trinity, based on some arguments that were going on for several hundred years before Muhammad arrived on the scene. And that is, his understanding of the Trinity is Father God, Mother God Mary, baby God Jesus. See, so they see the Trinity as three people. Okay, so of course a lot of them don't read the Quran, so they don't even know that. But if you got a guy that's versed in the Quran, that's what he's thinking. When we say Trinity, he's thinking Father God, Mother God, baby God. So he's thinking about the argument of the Council of Ephesus, where they argued, should we call Mary the Mother of God? And Nestorius, of course, he said, not a good idea. The next thing you know, they'll be worshiping Mary. Well, they voted him out, and guess what happened? Mary is now the, mediator along with Jesus in some Catholic circles, okay? So that's what you're dealing with. So here this you find this in the Quran. It's very typical of Middle Eastern, Arabic, and Chaldean, Hebrew language. We sent, following in their footsteps, Jesus, or they say Isa, son of Mary, confirming the Torah before him, and we gave to him the gospel, wherein is guidance and light, and confirming the Torah before it as a guidance and an admonition unto the God-fearing. So let the people of the gospel judge according to what God has sent down therein. Whosoever judges not according to what God has sent down, they are the ungodly. Now, this is a very powerful verse. There's actually another one in chapter 5, verse 47. It's very similar, which I won't read. But this is a very good verse to know about, because what it's saying is you Muslims should pay attention to the gospel. Because their argument is the gospel has been perverted. Now, isn't that what most of the cults say? The Bible's not reliable. The Mormons will say, well, the Bible's reliable as long as it was translated correctly. And so any time it contradicts their theology or their prophet, they'll say, well, that part wasn't translated correctly. So when you quote directly out of the Quran, you say, well, the Quran says you're supposed to believe in the gospel. Well, a lot of them don't even know this verse. So sometimes it's helpful. Not always, but sometimes it's helpful. Okay? So what we're dealing with is not just a theological issue, it's a historical issue as well. And most of you know this if you've read the Bible. You as pastors, you probably know as much or more than I do. But of course, Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. And of course, to us, Isaac is the promised son, a miraculous son. And of course, that points to the very foundation of our faith. Well, of course, Abraham also had another son through Hagar. Not a pretty picture there, it brings up another issue. Muslims cannot believe the Bible to be divinely inspired because it shows flaws in the characters of the Bible, and they just don't believe that God can use people that have issues. Okay? So they have to say that Muhammad is a perfect man in order to adhere to that way of thinking. Okay? So whenever you point out any flaws, or even a prophet in the Bible, or a patriarch that had a flaw, and obviously Abraham had some, David had some, most of the prophets had issues. They're just human like us, yet God used them. Well, they have a hard time with that, so they say, well, the Bible can't be correct because God wouldn't use imperfect beings. Well, of course, they don't know the story about Balaam and the donkey. God can speak to anybody. And if he could speak to a donkey, he might even use us. Huh? So, but they can't comprehend that. Another thing to keep in mind is the Quran quotes a lot from the Torah, from the first 5 books, and it makes reference to Noah, and it makes reference to Jonah, but Jonah is the only minor prophet that it makes reference to. So obviously Muhammad was exposed to a form of Judaism that was limited to the first 5 books and probably the book of Jonah. So that gives us a little bit of an idea of what he was exposed to as far as his understanding of Judaism. Okay? So here we have an ethnic issue. These 2 sons split, and God is in the redemption business. He cleans up our messes, right? Even he said he was going to actually bless, the children of this mess through Ishmael. Okay? Even though he said they would be like a donkey, I think, in one place. So it's not a real pretty picture, but see, this faction of these 2 groups, the Jews and the Arabs, have had issues since Abraham. Okay, but we have to go way beyond that now, because here there's 1/5 of the world's population are Muslims. That's a lot of people, 1.5 billion or something like that. A lot of people are Muslims. Now, they may not be very knowledgeable. They may be just social Muslims. They may be doing it. See, now, if you're a non-Muslim living in a Muslim country, if you want protected status, you have to pay the demi-tax. Okay? So oftentimes they will allow you to exist provided you pay the tax. So a lot of people will convert in order to get around the tax. So that's one of the issues that you're dealing with about why some people convert. This first picture is actually an engraving of the Dome of the Rock, which is on the foundation of the old Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Some of you have probably been to Jerusalem. I've never been there. Now this is what you run into oftentimes at fairs, especially in California, and farmers markets. It says, I love Jesus because I'm a Muslim. Okay? A couple of years ago, the Muslims had a campaign to put huge billboards in major cities all around the United States, and they had messages like this. There was one over in Seattle, up on North Seattle on Aurora, I think is where it was, or Broadway, I forget which. And a friend of mine took a picture and sent it to me, so I've got a collection of nearly all of these billboards, which I have a blog site, and I put up, anytime I find out something like this, I write an article about it, put it up on my blog. Okay, and this is the story, of course, Abraham going to sacrifice his son, and the angel, of course, God stopped him. Everybody knows the story, and provided a lamb, which is a pattern of God providing a lamb for us through the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, interestingly enough, on nearly all mosques, you will find the crescent. That's the symbol. Now, oftentimes, if you get into a conversation with Muslims, they will say, well, that is nothing more than a symbol of the Ottoman Empire. That's not a Muslim symbol. Okay? Well, that sounds good if you don't know anything, if you don't read the Bible. But this particular picture I put up here happens to mention that about 1600 years before Muhammad, the Midians fought against Israel. And most of us know the story. Gideon arose and took the crescent ornaments which were on the camels' necks, and the crescent ornaments that the kings of Midian wore, And there's a couple of verses there. That's Jude chapter 8 and Psalm 83 and Isaiah 3:18, if you want to look those up. So the crescent symbol is not really a new thing. It's not an Islamic thing. It predates Islam. Okay? Back during this time, a lot of the religions worship, the moon and the stars and all kinds of stuff. So there's a mixed bag of beliefs mixed up. And as you're reading the Quran, you'll find quotes from other areas outside of the Bible. You will find, there's one story that I find kind of hilarious. There's a story in the Quran, there's a whole chapter, it's called The Cave is the name of the chapter. And it's a legend about a couple of guys who were being persecuted by the emperor of whatever country they were in, I forget now what it is, and they went in this cave to run away from the persecution, and the king and his soldiers sealed up the cave. Okay, well, several hundred years later, somebody opened the doors of the cave, and these guys spring to life, and this is the miracle that's talked about in the Quran, okay? So this was a legend that was around during Muhammad's life, and he just happened to pluck it out of, the customs and the legends of the people, and he stuck it in the Quran. And you'll see other things, quotes from the Gospel of Thomas. Now, the Gospel of Thomas is a pseudepigrapha. It's a supposed gospel. It's not a real gospel. In fact, it wasn't even written in any of the, Arabic, Hebrew or Greek, any of the Bible languages. I think it was written in Egyptian, I forget the language it was written. But anyway, the earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of Thomas, I think they date back to the Nag Hammadi text, hundreds of years after Christ. So it's not a reliable gospel. However, Muhammad somehow had access to it, and he quotes a story where supposedly Jesus made a bird out of clay and breathed on it, and it flies away. You find this in the Quran. Okay, so this is plucked out of the pseudepigrapha, out of the Gospel of Thomas. There's also other stories he plucked out of the Gospel of Barnabas and other fictional literature of his time. So oftentimes when you refer to things like that, they'll say, well, see, the Bible's not correct because it doesn't even have that story in it. Well, and then when you start talking about the reliability of the Bible, thank God for whoever found the Dead Sea Scrolls, because that is it cements the reliability of the Old Testament back a couple hundred years before Christ. So when the Muslims say the Torah is not reliable, we can say, well, what do you do with this? This is stuff that obviously is found in our generation, and it proves that the Bible was reliable back then. Now there was no New Testament documents found there that we know of, or that I know of, but a lot of other things. Okay, so, and then, if you study anything about the manuscripts of the Bible, we all know that there's complete Bibles that date back to like the 4th century. You got the Sinaiticus, you got the Alexandrinus, and you can go to the British Library in London, you can see some of these. They have them in big glass cages. It's not like it's often some mysterious locked up, closet someplace. It's for public display. And you got the Rylands papyri of John's Gospel dates back to about the 1st century. So for them to take pot shots at the reliability of the Bible, they're either ignorant or they're being dishonest. Okay, so let me carry on here. Now, obviously, make room for some pigs. We don't want anyone to think that we're Muslims. This is Noah loading up the ark. This is always a fun one to talk to Muslims about because they think pigs are just absolutely terrible. Yet they often quote out of the Quran stories about Noah, or Nuh, as they call him, N-U-H. They refer to that story. However, they never thought it through that how did pigs get here? Unless somebody put them on the ark. Okay, so that's sometimes an interesting conversation to have. So let's fast forward a bit. A couple hundred years before Jesus, there was this Antiochus, of course, was giving the Jews a hard time. Most of you know a little bit about that probably. In 1st and 2nd Maccabees, in the Apocrypha, it tells a little bit of the story of that revolt. The Jews finally got fed up with it. For a while they were thinking miraculously God's going to deliver them from Antiochus. Well, it didn't happen for a long time, and so they decided they would take matters into their own hands, and they went to war against him. And but what happened there was a lot of persecution on the Jews, and a lot of them were driven out of Israel. And so you begin to find little enclaves of Jewish communities out in the desert, in little oases, okay? And then, of course, in 70 AD, remember Jesus in Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark chapter 13, Jesus talked about the temple. And of course, his disciples, they were in awe. It was a huge building. Herod had upgraded it considerably prior to the time of Christ. And of course, they were pretty proud of that. And Jesus says, not one stone is going to be left upon another that won't be torn down, right? Everybody knows the story. Okay, well then in 70 AD, we all know what happened. Titus, the Roman troops, surrounded the city, and Jesus said, when you see this happen, get out of town. Huh? So a lot of the people understood that, and they left. And then shortly after, the town was just totally destroyed. The temple was destroyed, and we can see the ruins of it to this day. Okay, well, so during that time, again, more Jews were scattered in what the Jews call the diaspora. Christians oftentimes don't use that term, but that's a very common term, the diaspora. They were scattered all over the place. And so again, a lot more Jews were scattered into Arabia, down the coast, in different places that are now Muslim countries. So then along comes Muhammad. The year 571 was when he was born. He died in 632. Now, in Saudi Arabia, is what we call it today, Mecca was a trading center. It was on a trade route. And so there was a lot of different religious ideas, a lot of different ethnic groups that passed through there just simply doing business. But the Arabs had stones set up in the middle of town, and each stone represented their tribal deity. There was a whole bunch of them. Okay, so once a year, they would get together to rally around their tribal deity. And this was kind of a way to keep all the different tribes together. Plus, it was good for business, huh? Go to Salt Lake, hey, that temple is great business for the Mormons down there, huh? So religious centers oftentimes there's money behind them. Kind of like in the book of Acts, Paul got in trouble for speaking out against Diana, the temple of Diana, and that didn't go over too well. So here, Muhammad grew up in Mecca with that type of environment. But then he got the idea that the Jews we might be able to appease the Jews and these monotheist people that believe in one God if we could just get rid of all the other tribal deities and promote my family deity. Huh? That's good, really good for business, especially if you're part of the family. Huh? So he brought that up, and of course, they didn't all agree with him. So they drove him out of town. So he moved north to a town called Yathrib, which today we call Medina. Medina simply means the city. Okay, so Yathrib mostly was a Jewish town. And, they weren't really into getting involved in a war because, hey, they'd been driven out of Israel, a lot of them. And so they left because they don't like conflict, okay? And then this guy shows up with this wild revelation, and they're just going, oh, great. While he's there, though, for a couple of years, he begins to rally a lot of the nomads and a lot of the desert tribes into an army. And he made a treaty with Mecca, which as soon as he was strong enough to break the treaty, he broke the treaty, and he invaded Mecca, destroyed all the idols except for the one that now exists in the Kaaba. In the corner of the Kaaba, I don't know if I have a picture of it that you can see, but in the corner of the Kaaba there's a stone that supposedly is what the remains of their tribal stone. And there's a lot of different stories about where it came from. Some say it was a meteorite or something like that. Who really knows? But this black stone is embedded in the corner of the Kaaba, and they rally around this thing, and then it's a big honor if you can kiss the stone. So sometimes I found it helpful when you're talking to Muslims to say, okay, you guys call us idolaters, and you call us polytheists because you say we believe in three gods, but what's this deal about kissing a stone? Doesn't that look like idolatry? Huh? So sometimes that's helpful in getting their gears to engage, that, never thought of that before, because within Islam, that's one of the pillars of their faith, is if you can afford it, you want to make at least one pilgrimage in your life to Mecca to rally around the stone. And then if you can get a chance to kiss the stone, that's even better. That's a very, very rare event because there's so many thousands of people show up. It's not likely you're going to get close to the stone, but to rally around it is a big deal. And then they go up to another area which over the past generation or so has been enlarged, really huge, to where they throw stones at this wall, and they say that is throwing stones at the devil, And I like to bring that up and say, now, don't you think this is kind of childish? You make fun of us as Christians because some of our simplistic ways of looking at things, but don't you think this is kind of childish, throwing stones at the devil? And so there's different things that you can bring up that are sometimes engaging. Okay, another thing that's sometimes helpful to bring up is when at one point Muhammad invaded this little oasis town called Khaybar, and it's a ghost town today. The ruins are still there. He invaded Khaybar, and he killed most of the men, Jewish town, and then he sold some of the younger ones into slavery, or took them into slavery for himself. And then he actually married a little 6-year-old girl. Now, a lot of more Muslims have no idea about this story, but it's reality. If you talk to imams, the guys that know about the Quran and the history, they know all about the story. And they really don't like to talk about it much because marrying a 6-year-old, that doesn't sound too good. And then he consummated the marriage when she was 9. All right, so this verse that I have up on the screen here is out of Zechariah. We're all familiar with it probably. It will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples, and all who live it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. Sounds kind of like today, huh? Well, of course, oftentimes prophecy is fulfilling in numerous ways. Okay, so the Jews, and a lot of the Jews, of course, are not religious Jews. The people who live there, they're not there for religious reasons. And of course, that's an argument that the Muslims will use against the Jews. They say, well, they're not religious. God, they have one of the biggest gay pride parades in Tel Aviv. What kind of religion is that? And you have to agree with them. A lot of the secular Jews are very ungodly people. However, when God has a plan, he's going to pull it off in spite of us. Okay? And the interesting thing about it, and Peggy and I, we lived on boats for a number of years, and one day we were with our boat and we were in Cordova, which is just south of Valdez, and we're tied up to the dock there, and this 2 gals and a guy come walking down the dock, and we get to talking to them. Next thing you know, they're on the boat. Of course, we're looking for an opportunity to witness to them, and we're having coffee, and this one gal has a real strong accent. I said, excuse me, well, what's your accent? Where are you from? She says, I'm from Israel. I said, wow, interesting. I said, well, do you believe in Yeshua HaMashiach? And she goes, I have a lot of questions about that. And the guy that's with him, he says, what did he say? Well, he just asked me if I believe that Jesus was the Messiah in Hebrew. And he says, well, do you? And of course, we're off and running, So then she begins to tell me the story of her grandparents moved from Europe to Israel during the kibbutz movement. And if you're familiar at all with the history of the Jews and the rebirth of the nation of Israel, the kibbutz movement was an effort. It was basically a lot of Jews went back to Israel and they started little communal farms. And of course they had to be communal, they had to work together because a lot of people there didn't care much for them, okay? So they had to stick together. And so that was how her grandparents came to Israel. But they didn't come there because they were religious. And she didn't explain to me why. But she says they weren't religious Jews. And I said, that makes it even better. I said, God has a plan for the Jews in spite of our beliefs. I said, that's the amazing part. I said, we like to think that we have a part in people's conversion. And I pray for people and I hope to think that God's answering my prayers, but ultimately God's the one that gets them, right? It's not because we're super saints, or we're great preachers or anything like that. Oftentimes people get saved from some of the worst preachers, and that's always amazing. Some of the people that preached in my parents' church, I look at them now and I go, oh, brother. So anyway, so even to this day, the Arabs would very much like to purge the Jews out of Israel. And there's an interesting little bit of history before Israel became a nation. Anybody familiar with Theodor Herzl? You understand that name? Okay, Theodor Herzl, I believe he was from Austria. I think he was originally going to be an attorney, but he turned out to be a journalist. And he was a Jewish guy. Wasn't really a very devout Jew. In fact, he had several kids, boys, that he never circumcised. So he wasn't much of a practicing Jew. However, God used Theodor Herzl to rally the Jews, a couple decades before the Nazis came into power. And Theodor Herzl got quite a bit of support from Christians because we were looking forward to the rebirth of Israel. Okay, now, prior to that, a lot of the people had the idea that now the church is Israel. That came out of the theology of Augustine, Catholic theology. After a couple of years, when Israel was no longer a nation and there was no longer a temple, Augustine apparently got the idea that, well, we got to give up on that idea. We need to come up with another idea that we are Israel. So that was one of the things that we're dealing with. Okay, an hour is coming for everyone who kills you think he's doing a service to God. Of course, that was fulfilled through the Jews to some degree, but it's still in fulfillment today through the Muslims. They would very much like to do away with us. Here's a quote from the Quran that says, "It is not for a prophet that he should have prisoners of war until he's made a great slaughter in the land." Doesn't sound very peaceful to me. Then Muhammad is quoted as saying, "I will expel the Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula and will not leave any but Muslims." Okay, well, that's the way it is today, Saudi Arabia. There are no churches. If you try to build one, you're not likely to get a permit. Okay, and they're really big into this martyr thing. Muhammad is quoted as saying, "I would love to be martyred in Allah's cause, then come back to life, then to be martyred, then come back to life, be martyred, then come back to life again, and then get martyred." So that's the spirit behind Islam. Then the Dome of the Rock actually is a testimony against the Jews and the Christians. On the walls of the inside of the Dome of the Rock, on the old foundation of the Jewish temple, are anti-Christian and anti-Jewish quotes from the Quran. One is, "Praise be to Allah who has not taken unto himself a son." They don't believe in the Son of God. "Who has no partner in the sovereignty, nor hath he any protected friend through dependence, and magnify him with all magnificence." So they attack the Trinity and the deity of Christ with all the strength they've got. Well, I could go on for a long time, but I want to, let's see, give a brief update of what's happening right now. The Ottoman Empire, of course, spread throughout from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spain all the way to India. Okay, that was what they called the Caliphate, which would be similar to the Pope would be in the head of the Catholic Empire. The Roman Empire, well, they have a Caliph, and strangely enough, the guy that's the head of Turkey right now, he's been trying to boast himself as the new Caliphate of Islam. It's not working too well for him, but he's been trying. Okay, so there's 57 nations that show up at the UN. It's called the OIC, the Organization of Islam Organization. And these 57 nations, of course, they're all Muslim nations, and they go there for the simple reason to reestablish the caliphate. So that's what we're dealing with at the UN. And thank God we have some people in administration now that understand that and are doing a little pushback, if you've been following any of the news.